powered by Rev Media in partnership with TSN. This is our pre-trade deadline edition of the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast, proudly presented by Tim Hortons. Yes, you know that Roll Up to Win is back now through March 23rd. Play for a chance to win tens of millions of prizes, including electric Volkswagen ID Buzz vehicles, ATV vacations, electronic gift cards, Tim's products, and so much more. Tim's Rewards members earn one digital roll with each eligible purchase of select drinks, breakfast, or meal items. Plus, while supplies last, guests can also receive Roll Up to Win hot beverage cups with a roll to reveal underneath the rim. Oh, we got a great show today. No Ray Ferraro. He's doing a little bit of traveling, but we got 2/3 of the dream team, the TSN/Athletic Hockey Insider team. Darren Dreger sitting in the B chair today. I'm sitting proudly in the A chair. And Chris Johnston from the Athletic and TSN, supporting local with the hat and joining us today, CJ. Love the Bears. What's the story there?
Yeah, it's a mom and pop shop here in Toronto, a husband and wife team that make clothing. So
love it.
I walked in their show. I walked in there once, 4 or 5 years ago. I bought this bear hat. I swear I've gotten more discussion and compliments on this thing than anything I've ever bought in my life. So I've tried to send them some business. They're called North Standard Trading Post.
Love it. Looking good.
Beautiful.
So just so people understand, I mean, we have the benefit of both you on this show here today. How much are you two communicating day to day right now? Like, will you be sick of each other by the end of the week, Dregs and Pierre?
Yeah. By the time the deadline rings, or we're let out of jail at TSN Friday early evening, we'll probably have had enough of close proximity. But I think for the most part, this is what we do. I mean, it's more intense this week, and it has been for the last number of days. But we do insider trading Tuesday and Thursday, basically all season long, right? So Pierre, CJ, and I are in constant communication. CJ, I think we can tell this story. I'll tell it anyway. So we're recording this episode.
Oh boy, I love it.
Tuesday morning, and I'm going to give Chris a ton of credit because the TSN Trade Bait board that's out there, the graphic that we see on all platforms, he invests a lot of time, and I tinker with it. I try and help when I can. Mm-hmm. So we have a meeting with Steve Dryden, near and dear to your heart, Ryan, this morning, Tuesday morning, and we haven't finalized the list, but he's going to freshen it up for consuming for today, maybe even tomorrow, and we'll do that as things change. Anyway, I reference this group chat that we have. And it's a collection. Sorry, Ryan, you're not in the group chat, but it's whatever. Chris and I, it's Pierre, it's Bobby Mack, the outsider, Bobby Mack, Dryden, Mike Lane. I think that's essentially it, right, Chris? I think that's the extent. Anyway, we share all of our stuff.
No, James. Right? James doesn't want to be bugged.
No, James doesn't want it. I mean, honestly, for anyone listening, I'm sure they'd love to be part of it because we're just spitballing everything that we hear. Dryden was complaining about it on the conference call this morning because he's not included on the chain. Well, yes, he is. He just didn't realize he was. So it tells you the last time he actually checked his WhatsApp, because how many days when we've been doing this, there would be miles of information, CJ, in the exchanges that we've had in the last week or 10 days.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of nonsense in there too. Ryan, I was thinking when you put it this way, right now, literally probably my last text before bed and my first text in the morning is going to Dregs or Pierre. So
exactly.
That's kind of the scope of where, when you get this close to the deadline, like literally it doesn't end throughout the day. And then basically, like literally the other night, Dregs is like, I got to wake up early. I'm going to bed. It's like we're on a shift. Like, well, I got you. Don't worry. I'm up another couple hours in case something happens. Because the truth is, honestly, we get more late night trades in this league in the last couple of years than we ever did. It's on the regular now. So we almost have to make sure someone's up at any hour to handle anything that might come along.
Yeah, GM's up late at night. Do I do it? Do I not? Couple of glasses of vino, I'm doing it, and then you get your late night trades. Well, it's going to be an interesting week, guys, and certainly looking forward to it. I know how busy you're going to be. Just setting up the show today real quick. We're going to do a quick rip through all 7 Canadian teams. in our headline segment. And then we're going to do some rapid fire catch-all sort of segment about other stuff we could see happening around the league. So let's get to it with our headlines brought to you by Tim Hortons. And any conversation this year in the National Hockey League about a Canadian team, we're bound by law to start with the Vancouver Canucks, drama central. So hurtling towards the trade deadline here, Dregs, they're not out of it. They find themselves in the mix, as messy as things have been. And the storylines have been aplenty. So as you look at the Vancouver Canucks in this upcoming deadline, what do you think the headline strategy is for Rutherford, Allvin and company?
Well, number one is to acquire a center, best available center, but that center also has to have the criteria of speed. I know that the coaching staff of the Vancouver Canucks just feel that, not that they're a slow team, but since you're adding, I mean, your wish list has to include the parameters of the player that you need to make you better, maybe different, but certainly to contend against the likes of the top teams in the West, Vegas, Edmonton, Winnipeg, of course. I mean, go down the list. And that's where it gets tricky. So when you think of the centers that are available right now, and I think we'll push Braden Shen just aside for a moment, because where the Blues are, it seems a little far-fetched. Not that Army isn't afraid to do something out there and drastic, so I'm not closing the book on it entirely. So you think of Scott Laughton with the Philadelphia Flyers. I don't see him as a fit in Vancouver. He might be a good fit for the Toronto Maple Leafs as a third-line center or some of the other clubs. So this is where it gets real tricky. What does that center market look like? So is it Brock Nelson? If Lou decides with the New York Islanders, okay, well, this guy can still skate. He's not going to sign with us. So there's lots of teams that are intrigued and interested in Brock Nelson, but primarily in Vancouver, CJ, that's what they're looking for. I mean, and now more than ever, because of the way that Elias Pettersson has come out of the Four Nations faceoff, it feels imperative that they get a centerman that can shoulder the number 2 spot, but maybe even number 1. And, you know, aside from the guys we've speculated on, I think you got to look outside the box with some of the conversations that Allvin and Jimmy Rutherford are probably having on players that we haven't even heard about.
Makes sense to me. I mean, look, you could scour the trade bait list for all afternoon. You're not going to find really what you've outlined there, Dregs. I mean, there's just not a lot of depth at that position. And so that it makes sense that Vancouver's got to look beyond the box and you know, try to maybe think of a player, maybe someone with term. You know, obviously every team wants someone younger that could be part of their team for the future. Might not end up clicking that box. And, you know, I'm curious where the Canucks land with Brock Besser. I mean, the outcome, of course, could just be nothing happens, that they keep him on the team, that they don't extend him by Friday. But, you know, these deadlines, it's a trade deadline, but it tends to be a bit of a negotiating deadline for players, at least a soft one that are on expiring contracts. And so, you know, it seems right now, at least, and this is certainly got an asterisk because it could change, that they're nowhere on an extension with Brock Besser. Obviously, there have been discussions going back a long, long time, and they haven't got anywhere. But, you know, it would be hard for me to imagine them trading him. But it feels like all options are on the table as possibilities, just because they aren't close to signing him and he is an asset. And, you know, does that factor in? Could that help them get a center? I mean, those are probably the types of conversations the Canucks are going through in the lead up to this deadline.
Mm-hmm. And he's a player, obviously, that can provide, you know, some secondary scoring too, right? So if Besser actually hits the trade market, that's going to be fascinating for us. And this is what we'll do for the next few days, and hopefully it's on Friday on TSN, where he lands. You know, if you're Vancouver, you'd like to ship him to the East. And I've heard some low-level rumors about, what about Florida? Yeah, I mean, Billy Zito already made his splash with Seth Jones, but there's still some space available there because of the Matthew Tkachuk scenario and whatnot. I mean, I could see it, but, you know, and you're probably not getting back in Vancouver what you need in moving Besser anyway. So you're probably just exhausting, you know, the negotiations at that point and trying to fill a hole, maybe with a player that has some term left. If it's not Florida, it could be any number of teams, but something we're watching closely.
Elias Pettersson's also, it's always going to be something we're talking about until something changes, whether it's the quality of his play or his location. But if the Canucks get into the playoffs here, Dregs, and Pettersson can somehow find it, is there potential for the narrative to change if that happens?
Yeah.
This guy needs to put together a good playoff year, and maybe that's what can stem the tide a little bit.
I think that's plausible. I do. Every time I ask, which is on the daily, the messaging I get back out of Vancouver is we're not shopping them, right? And how do you get value back? Let's be honest here. For Pettersson, based on his lack of production, the way he's played. Now, coming out of the break, they actually felt like he was starting to turn a little bit. There was a little bit more compete in his game, but the measure of the player is primarily coming down to production at 11.6 million per. So I think that Patrick Galvin is open to conversation now. But I'm kind of with you. I mean, if this drifts into the offseason, sure. Now you're dealing with 31 other clubs, so there's more flexibility, provided the player is willing to do that, but likely happens before July 1st. He still has upside. There's a skill set there. If he takes stock, and this is what is expected of him, of what he has to invest to be the player that he can be, then I think that there's opportunity. If it's not in Vancouver, then definitely there are teams out there who feel like they've got the perfect kind of recipe to get him back on track.
When you talk about a deadline, July 1st is the deadline. That's when Elias Pettersson gets a no movement clause. And so again, it doesn't mean that anything has to happen, but between now and July 1st, obviously the Canucks need to decide, do we want to explore the market on him? Again, this is probably more of an off-season conversation than one that's going to happen by Friday. And the deadline, but do they look to move them more aggressively before the summer, comes around? If depending on what, I guess, in large part what we see and down the stretch here and into the playoffs, Ryan, and it does stand as kind of a line in the sand moment, because obviously once a player gets that NMC, it's really difficult to move them. You've really got to work on their timetable. It just might not, quite frankly, happen. And I don't know what's going on with Pettersson. I think this might be one of the most perplexing stories anywhere in the league. Because he's basically, I think he signed last year on March 3rd. So we're almost exactly a year since he signed that $11.6 million contract. He's got a little less than 60 points in that calendar year. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that, we're talking about a 100-point player just to have that kind of drop off. It's the off ice, element that's been discussed with him. Is he injured? I mean, it might be a combination of all of the above, but they got to find a way to hit refresh on it. I don't know if you can do that in season, but this is a strange one because the talent has not disappeared, but something as big is missing in his game.
And before, guys, we move off the Vancouver Canucks, I think we should talk about Carson Soucy, right? His name has been out there for a long, long time. It is also a curious one. I'm not saying it doesn't belong. Of course it does. And we know that memos were sent out. We know that the club had a conversation with Carson Soucy and his agent, Jerry Johansson, a couple of weeks ago, just to say, look, we'd like to move you. We'd like to explore some interest in what that trade might look like. Are you good with that? Keeping in mind, he's got a no-move clause, and he has a young family. And at that time, I think his response was, well, if there's a better fit for me, he wants to play. He wants to be a contributing influence. But it's been real quiet around Carson Soucy in terms of the communication, I believe, right? So again, we're recording this Tuesday morning. A lot can change with a phone call, but when you're a player who controls the process with a no-move clause, and it's gone quiet for several days, that can impact the outcome of a trade pretty quickly. So there's a few things keeping our attention on the Canucks this week.
All right, let's nudge our way east. We'll head to the Calgary Flames. As the time of this taping, they are in the second wildcard spot in the Western Conference, tied with the Vancouver Canucks, but a slight edge there at 65 points. They have some players teams might like, Dregs, but don't know that Craig Conroy is going to be moving anybody out at this point, certainly not vets, as they're very much in the race. So what do you expect Craig Conroy's deadline to look like?
Well, it could be very quiet. Not to say that he's not interested. I mean, of course he is. I mean, he's trying to upgrade in a lot of different positions. The two key guys I think that you're hinting at, Ryan, one would be Rasmus Andersson and what they do with him. Contractually, they have time on their side. And CJ, you chime in here because it sure feels like Conroy has the stomach to just wait this out. Let's see where we're at in June. See what the player wants. what does the organization look like? I mean, if they lock a playoff spot down and have any level of success, then a lot of things can shift on that landscape. And the other one is out there. It's Nazem Kadri and things that swirl around. And I don't have any doubt that teams, of course, would call on him. You think of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Any team that's looking for a center is going to make that call. But Naz likes Calgary. Calgary likes him. And again, if they get to that place, it feels like that's more in the offseason. So it could be a quiet time for Conroy and hockey operations of the Flames.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of the Rasmus Andersson talk is starting outside Calgary. Like I think it's other teams wanting to manifest his availability just because, as I mentioned, like there's really not a lot on the market right now for defensemen. Certainly when you look at defensemen that could make an impact, there's a few names. Rasmus Ristolainen has had a renaissance in Philadelphia. He's a right shot D, but Anderson can fit a specific need for a lot of teams. You just look, it's a strange anomaly, but there's way fewer right shot defensemen in the NHL. So almost every team tends to need one, especially good teams. And so I think that it's everybody else phoning Calgary saying, hey, Anderson's up in a year's time. What are you doing there? But I'm with you, Dregs. I would be stunned if the Flames did anything to weaken their chances at a playoff spot, and removing, one of their top defensemen would clearly do that here, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
And so unless, look, you listen to these conversations. If you're Conroy, you're not hanging up the phone. Maybe somebody's going to offer you something you feel like you can't refuse. But the reality is, I think that Conroy made his move. He got Farabee and Frost in that deal with Philly, in January, and wants to give his team a chance to see this through. They've been in the playoff chase all year long, maybe against a lot of outside expectations, and I don't see them being certainly an aggressive buyer, but can't imagine them selling under these conditions either.
Yeah. And Ryan, you'll find this interesting because Calgary is among the many teams that are looking what happened with Edmonton and the St. Louis Blues plucking two really good players away on offer sheets. And a lot of teams are doing that, but I know the Flames are, right? They're looking at the restricted free agent class. But that cuts both ways. I mean, you can identify a list of vulnerable teams and the 10, 20 players, RFAs that you think could help, might be of interest, but you don't think that teams around the NHL learned the lesson that, and I'm not saying it was bad management by the Edmonton Oilers. They just got parked into a corner and really couldn't do a whole lot with it. I mean, you're trying to negotiate extensions with Broberg and you're trying to get stuff done. But at the end of the day, you have to be mindful of where that player slots in your own salary cap world. So it was the perfect storm in Edmonton, but I think teams like Calgary and others are trying to find whether or not there could be vulnerability very similar to what the Oilers went through. So it could be an intriguing offseason in Calgary.
Well, and people now see that it's possible. It felt like it wasn't very viable over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We just never saw them happen. We never saw them successful. Well, now owners all over the place have seen, hang on, like you guys all told me we couldn't do that. And now it's out there that it can happen. Should have matched on Dylan Holloway, by the way. Let's get to the Edmonton Oilers now, Dregs. So Stan Bowman in his first deadline in the big chair for the Edmonton Oilers, and they're kind of in this purgatory waiting on Evander Kane and whether or not they have his cap space to spend heading into this year's deadline, Dregs. My understanding is there is no wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We'll see you for the first game of the playoffs, Evander. Like maybe we've seen in other cities. I don't believe that is the case here, Dregs. And so I think there's a real cloud of uncertainty heading into this deadline for Stan Bowman and company.
A real tough spot for the Edmonton Oilers management group. And I guess I can appreciate from Evander Kane's standpoint as well. I mean, he's a hockey player, right? I mean, it's not his job to manage the cap of the Edmonton Oilers. He had surgery when he did. He's put in the work. He continues to put in the work. He just wants to play and he wants to perform and he wants to help this team in the playoffs. And he probably feels that if he's ready to go, it's in his best interest to get ready on the ice in games prior to the game one of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But as you've outlined, that doesn't help the Oil between now and 3:00 Eastern on Friday. I mean, there's lots of speculation around him. And I get the same thing, Ryan, that you've heard, that's the internal message, the expectation that Kane is going to be ready before the playoffs and wants to be in the lineup before the playoffs. So you can't use that space. So, how much is Stan Bowman investing in trying to find a trade fit for Evander Kane? And that is going to be tricky as well. I'm sure he'd love to be able to move that piece for all the reasons that we would expect. It is not going to be that easy unless, CJ, you've got a magic formula or a team out there that can convince Evander that he's the great fit and can make the money work and all of those things.
Well, yeah, it's going to be pricey is what it's going to be in terms of what other type of asset do you have to give up as a sweetener. And even if you're another team who sees Evander as a positive asset, meaning you think he can help your team because he's signed through next season, the Oilers are in somewhat of a pinch here. I mean, they're looking to move this contract because they want that space to do other things. And I suppose if there's one glimmer of hope, we'll call it, in those conversations for Edmonton, is just in a rising cap environment. I do think there's an ability to move contracts more than there has been in recent memory. Now, that doesn't guarantee it's going to happen here. Obviously, Kane does have an ability to say which 16 teams he can be dealt to as well. There's a lot of moving pieces to this, as I'm sure you're dialed into, Ryan. I can't yet say which way I feel it's going to go, but it's a pretty unusual circumstance. I can't think of anything quite like this in the past. And there's always conspiracy theories out there when it comes to players that are injured. This is all cooked up. Like I always say, pushing back on that, most players don't want to sit out. I mean, most players don't want to, just rejoin the lineup for game one of the playoffs. And so I can understand where Evander Kane's at as an individual, not to mention the fact if he does sit out till game one of the playoffs, they might be acquiring another player who plays ahead of him eventually down the line. Not saying officially that's part of his thinking, but should be in the calculation there. So, I mean, this is a complicated situation. It's probably not one, if you're in the Oilers front office, you want to be dealing with this close to the deadline because there's a lot of balls to be juggled, and they're obviously looking to upgrade their team and take another run at a long playoff run.
Well, and they end up basically, if they can't use that space, having to be a dollar in, dollar out team, Dregs, which you go, okay, well, you got to get creative and might have to move players off your roster. Well, maybe a cautionary tale here, buddy, because I'm going to list off some names here. Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Zach Hyman, Evander Kane, modified, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Victor Arvidsson, Adam Henrique, Jeff Skinner, all players with trade protection. Matthias Janmark, also with modified trade protection. Everybody on this team can call their shot to a degree. So you're looking for contracts you can move out. I mean, Kapanen, Brown, Podkolzin, I guess. They could use him. And then they've got a few guys on D, but there's not a lot of roster flexibility here.
It's an excellent point by you, and it's been overlooked. And then you balance that with the needs that this team has, right? I mean, they'd like to add, we know this, they'd like to find an upgrade on John Klingberg if that's available to them. They'd like to add a competitive forward, a penalty killer, somebody with some chops there. Despite what management of the Edmonton Oilers says, they have to have had some conversations about the goalie. Now, I'm not sure what that upgrade is, but that's just all part of going through your due diligence, again, as a management group and trying to find areas of need. And if you get a defenseman you feel is an upgrade, well, maybe that takes some of the heat off. Or if you get that competitive forward, as I've described, well, maybe that takes some of the heat off. But there's no way, given all the restrictions that we've talked about here, that Stan Bowman is going to be able to get all of that done.
Yeah, it feels a little eerie hearing you say dollar in, dollar out, Ryan. I mean, it feels like the Oilers are in that spot almost every deadline, doesn't it? And look, the Matthias Ekholm deal was a deadline deal, and that's one that's obviously paid dividends. So it doesn't mean you can't make a good move in that case. I mean, it required Nashville to keep salary over those multiple years left on his deal. There are ways to get creative, but it just feels like a tough pinch for a team that probably needs a little boost too. Obviously, a little slow out of the gates here on the other side of the Four Nations break. Look, it's great to have some of the best players in the world, but to come with a lot of expectations. And I think there's only a few management groups around the league under the kind of pressure that Edmonton is, and I think they're in the top handful right now.
No question. Be fascinating to see how Stan Bowman and company handle this next couple of days. Let's move on to the Winnipeg Jets, one of the great stories in the league this year. Number one as we speak. They do have some needs, though, Dregs, believe it or not. And could they go big game hunting? And by big game, I mean big game Brock Nelson potentially hunting.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible for sure. That would be a player of interest, but that is big game hunting. And you know where it gets tricky? And I don't think Edmonton is in this class anymore because of Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final and McDavid and Draisaitl. But I mean, when you look at Calgary, Winnipeg, Ottawa, the smaller teams in the National Hockey League, or in the Canadian side of things, Winnipeg is a tough sell, despite the fact that they're in first place in the National Hockey League. Tough sell for players. So I think the challenges that Cheveldayoff faces are obvious. Number one, what is the market really? And do we know for certainty, which we don't as we record, that Brock Nelson is officially a player in play? I mean, it's Lou Lamoriello and the New York Islanders, and they're kind of in the mud there in the Eastern Conference. He might just dig in and say, no, I'm going to take my chances and try and convince this guy, who he loves, by the way, that I'm going to extend. So Cheveldayoff has to find out, okay, is Brock in play? What is the cost? And then furthermore, is Brock Nelson willing to go to Winnipeg? And that's where it gets super, super challenging for the Winnipeg Jets. They've been burned on this more times than we can count. And then the other side of it is, I don't know that they have specific needs. They'd like to add another forward, but they want to be careful not to tinker too much because that group has been really, really good, especially in their top six. So that's why I look at somebody like Yoel Armia from the Montreal Canadiens, a former Winnipeg Jet. He might be a good add at an affordable price because he can play in your bottom six, but if somebody gets hurt, he can also slide up into your top six. So that's a nice fit for them. And then, like every other contending general manager, you're always looking for depth on the blue line. So what does that look like? I mean, there's lots of speculation around Brandon Carlo, Chris, with the Boston Bruins. I saw something linking Calgary Flames to him. Doesn't make sense to me with the injuries that Boston has, but that type of a defenseman, an Alexiak, somebody like that, if you don't get the big piece up front, then I could see Cheveldayoff maybe swinging a little bit harder for a defenseman.
Yeah, I know we're focused on the Canadian teams here, but I feel like there's a lot of shades between Winnipeg and Washington. Two teams at the top of their respective conferences, both having really nice years that, I mean, look, Winnipeg had a lot of success in the regular season last year as well, but Washington's success maybe a bit more surprising. And when you're making decisions at the deadline, how much do you want to disrupt what's worked? And, I think there is some risk there. And, the other part of what I'm hearing, Dregs, is if you're in Winnipeg and it can be a hard sell on the market, do you want to give up your draft capital, right? Because part of the success of the Jets, in my view, is how well they've drafted and developed players. They've continually found guys, even though obviously some of their first rounders have left town, while still established NHL players. Like they've kept that pipeline full. And so they're balancing a different set of dynamics than, some other teams out there. I mean, the Florida Panthers, for example, they're not picking in the first round for the foreseeable future because every year at the deadline, they're trading their first rounder for upgrades. But, I think a team like Winnipeg, you have that internal debate. I mean, as much as you want to be in the big names, and at this deadline, Brock Nelson does count as a big name. Been at the top of trade bait, but do you want to give up that draft pick and risk basically bringing someone along down the line? I think that every team is balancing the needs of today and the future, but in a place like Winnipeg, you really have to be sensitive to that. And so if it ends up being a quieter deadline for the Jets, I don't see that as a miss. I mean, it might, maybe in the market, they might take some heat because you're like, what, your guys are the best team in the league and you're not going for it. But, going for it can look different depending on, the market conditions you're navigating.
All right, the Ottawa Senators, they're in the fight, very much in the wild card fight, sitting a point back as of the time of this taping. CJ, I'll let you go first on the Ottawa Senators. What's the need and how active you think they'll be?
It's one of these places where it feels like the desire to make a deal is high, but I just don't know that with the salary cap constraints they're faced with, if Steve Staios is going to be able to do quite that. I mean, certainly we would include them on any list of teams looking for, help at forward. I think that, when the deadline's said and done, that they will have made at least some kind of move to bolster their group in that department. But, they're kind of jammed up in a tough spot cap wise. They also have lost one of their first round picks, whether it's this year or next, as the penalty for, a trade that was made with the Dadonov deal before even Michael Andlauer was owning the team and Staios was in the management office. So, they're maybe pinned in a tough spot. But that being said, they haven't played a playoff game since they went to Game 7 double overtime of the Eastern Conference Final in 2017. I mean, there's a whole generation of kids in Ottawa that have grown up and not seen their team in the playoffs. And so obviously there's tremendous value to that. And the Senators have hung tough this year through some injuries and other things to have themselves in position. So I think it's one of these ones where the front office understands how important this could be for the group. They've been thirsting for an opportunity to play meaningful games in March and April, for the Kachucks and the Norrises and all these young guys, Stützle, Sanderson, that have, given them hope and given them a spot where they can be this team. So I think they'd love to be big players at the deadline, but reasonably speaking, I'm just not sure that's going to be out there for them because of the things going on.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. And I mean, there's a healthy appetite to allow that core with Brady Tkachuk and Tim Stützle and Pinto and Norris and Bathurst. I mean, go down the list. Shabbat, throw them all into the mix to experience what is required, the investment needed to lock down that playoff spot and then see what happens. Now, there's a chance that they get Nick Cousins back too, right? And if they do after the trade deadline, that's going to feel like a significant piece coming back into the equation. And you do have to give Steve Staios and company credit for some of the significant ads they've already brought in. I mean, starting with Linus Ullmark. If Linus Ullmark can stay healthy, number one, and play as well as he has coming out of the Four Nations, then I think that they're in pretty good shape. But I'll tell you, and CJ touched on this, I'm not closing the door on possibilities with any club because Ottawa fits into that conversation that we alluded to earlier, where we're looking at players that are on trade bait graphics that we think teams are talking about. But that's a fraction of what the conversations are behind the scenes, right? Could Ottawa be a bigger player than what we expect? Well, that wasn't the message that I got from Steve Staios when I talked to him the other day, but that's not to say that he's not open for something more significant, whatever that looks like. So could be quiet, maybe not. I learned that from Bob McKenzie a long, long time ago.
I was going to say, this is just a personal thing. We were all together at the Four Nations, guys. I just want to see Brady Tkachuk in the playoffs. I think this guy's built to be, he's a showman, he's a performer, and he hasn't had a chance to play that level of game yet. So, I mean, look, he scored a big goal late to get them at least a point in Washington on Monday night. I think this guy's built for playoff hockey, and we're going to see it eventually, but it would be kind of cool this spring if the Senators could get in and he gets a taste of that.
Someone's going to have to let him know you're not supposed to fight every other game in the playoffs, though. Drop in the mitts with Tom Whittleson. Let's find the biggest, toughest guy on the other team and just see what happens. Don't look now. Here come the Montreal Canadiens, 5 consecutive wins. They're a point back. Wow. So here they are. Decisions to make here on some guys we've talked about already. Evans and Armia, Savard and company, Dregs. What are we going to see here strategy-wise from the Habs?
Well, first of all, I'm shocked that you've buried the Toronto Maple Leafs. That is such a Western Canadian media thing to do.
What are you talking about?
Anyway, here we go with the Montreal Canadiens. Yeah, I mean, kind of similar to Ottawa in that Montreal wants to protect the group in everything that they've invested, right? So I do think that trades are going to be made. Tweeted about this earlier today. There is progress in talks with Jake Evans, who's, as CJ knows, he's been working this file for a long time. I mean, this guy has garnered a lot of interest because of the position of center that he plays, right? I mentioned Armia, the potential of a connection in Winnipeg. I mean, there are lots of teams kicking tires there, but Montreal also has a number of guys, and I'm not going to mention names, who are playing banged up. And they're invested in trying to kind of drag this team right to the finish line of qualifying for the playoffs. So that's what Ken Hughes is wrestling with right now. Are you better to get a third-round pick for Yoel Armia or a second-round pick if that's what it is for Jake Evans? Or do you need those guys to help you get to game 82 and maybe secure a playoff spot? And Savard's name is out there, but I think CJ loosely, right? Because, again, a high-character, qualified player who means more to the organization than another draft pick. So I'm kind of flummoxed with Montreal to see what they do on the bigger side of things. It, again, like so many others, it may be an underwhelming trade deadline for Ken Hughes.
Yeah, I get the sense they feel like they're worried they're in no man's land a little bit because, you win 5 in a row to get 1 point out. But let's face it, are they a good enough team to win 8, 9 in a row, 10 in a row? I mean, I don't want to sit here and say they're going to fall back, but they could conceivably fall back too, right? And so how do you navigate that from the front office? They've also sold a lot at the previous deadlines, right? That they did some nice business, getting Sean Monahan for a first, then flipping him for a first. They Ben Sherrod a couple years ago. And so, they maybe aren't under the same pressure another team might be to get that draft pick capital, but it feels like that would be an interesting war room to be sitting in the next 72 hours in Montreal, because I think there are legit arguments to be made on both sides of the table about, moving on from some of these guys. I mean, look, I'll take Jake Evans and look, it sounds like he's a top-notch guy. I don't know him personally, but he is a fourth line center at the end of the day. But right now at this deadline where there are almost no centers available, he's a right shot. He's really good in the dot. He's a good penalty killer, 3 shorthander goals this year. Like, he has a value because, teams are looking for specialists right now. Like, he will never probably have more trade value than he does in these next 3 days. And so, obviously in the short term, if they traded him, that would hurt their chances for, the next 6 weeks, but they could maybe, get something great out of that. I mean, I think that's where the debate falls. And certainly as of this morning, no decisions made. As Dregs says, if they're still talking contract, I mean, there's a world he gets a raise, he gets an extension, and he's out of the top 10 on trade bait, just like that.
All right. Well, we're out of time, so we're not going to get to the Leafs today, guys. But this has been great. I'm kidding. I know where my bread is buttered. I'm just kidding. I wanted to save them for last, gentlemen. The Toronto Maple Leafs, really well positioned, playing pretty well. 8 wins in their last 10 games. Dregs, they have to be feeling good about things, but the itch is going to be there to add. We're hearing lots about Shen potentially. Will there be a big splash of some sort for the Leafs?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say yes, there will be, because if we're having this conversation Friday on air at TSN as part of our trade center, man, it would be tremendous. And I look at Brad Treliving and management of the Maple Leafs, they're still open to that. Until Doug Armstrong says flatly, we're not trading Braden Shen. And as we alluded to earlier, why would you? He's your captain. He's an impactful piece. The Blues are in the playoff equation. Could take as many as the equivalent of 3 first-round picks to acquire this guy. And that might clear the prospect cupboard of the Maple Leafs if you're talking about Cowan, Minton, Danford. I mean, these are big parts potentially of the future in Toronto. But they do need a center. So if it's not Braden Shen, who is it? Is it Scott Lawton for the Philadelphia Flyers? Sure, nice ad. Scotty Lawton would love to get traded to the Maple Leafs for personal reasons. Well, it's not like Danny Briere is throwing Brad Treliving the life preserver here. No, it's the equivalent of a first-round draft pick or the first in 2026 plus something if Philadelphia has to take a contract back. So is that too much for, let's call Scotty Lawton what he is. He's a real good third-line center, but that would be the ask. Or do they go deeper into the pool and maybe get more incremental in how they approach the deadline? And it's a lower-level center. Maybe it's a better defenseman, those sorts of things. So I think at this stage, every scenario is plausible with the Maple Leafs.
Yeah, but the underlying theme I'm hearing, Dregs, and it sounds like you're getting there too, is that right now it doesn't seem like anything big is coming together. And that could still happen, because I think the Leafs certainly are open to that. It's not coming together because Toronto's like, hey, we have to do something smaller. It's more about the market not really yielding those players. Toronto, much like Edmonton and some other top teams, Ottawa I mentioned, doesn't have a ton of cap space, so they have to have retention involved, and there's, it's not as simple as just adding a player. There's a little bit more of you need Brandon Pridham, their cap guru, in there making sure everything, all the numbers add up, and we'll take him at his word if the deal goes through. But it does feel like it's getting to maybe they're looking at some smaller stuff. Now, I'm still hopeful. We haven't seen very many trades league-wide in the last few days or weeks. And, I still think there could be a team or two that we're not really that focused on right now that could become a seller or might make a player or two available that, that changes the dynamic here. I mean, I'll put it another way. If I'm a team out there and my team's a bit on the line, but I'm looking at this market and I have a center that maybe has some appeal, like this might be the time to become a seller, even if you're sort of in the middle. So, I think the Leafs are open to all those options. I think they've, Brad Treliving's called on every center in the league. This has been an identified need for 4 or 5 months. And so they're getting down to decision time in Toronto, but, I don't get the sense that they've decided on a path. I think that they're still waiting and hoping that maybe something a little bit more enticing opens up, because right now it's looking, with respect to whoever those players are, that they're just going to be adding depth pieces, not headline grabbers at this point.
All right. All 7 Canadian teams wrapped up nice and tidy. You're right around 40 minutes. Those were your headlines brought to you by Tim Hortons. Okay, gentlemen, normally we do an Ask Us Anything segment here brought to you by ACOM. We're going to do it a little different, a little rapid fire, because we want to get around the rest of the National Hockey League, but that is brought to you by ACON. If you're a skilled tradesperson or construction professional, you're looking for work in Western Canada, they want to hear from you. They're looking for skilled tradespeople, construction professionals to join the ACON team and start building what matters today. If you got a resume and you want to get it in front of them, it's really easy. Send your resume to trades@acon.com. That is trades@acon.com, a construction leader and proud to be one of Canada's original industrial contractors. All right. Took up a little bit too much time in that first segment, guys, so we'll actually try and do some rapid fire here. I did. Okay. We want to do a word count, Dregs? You want me to get Zuby to do a word count when this thing's done? Won't even be close. All right, let's have at her here. Mikko Rantanen, CJ, I'll start with you. Percentage chance that he gets traded and percentage chance that he signs a deal with Carolina at some point. So I'm looking for 2 numbers from you.
I'd say 20% chance he's traded, just because I don't see them getting a better player than Martin Necas as the core to that deal, and that's who they gave up to get him. And obviously Carolina's trying to win a cup this year. Percentage chance he signs, I'm going to put it even smaller than that. I think 5% chance. And basically I'm leaving some window open there just because who knows, maybe they go on a run to the cup final. Maybe he falls in love with Raleigh and everything goes great. I mean, there's still time, I think, to sell him on the opportunity. But let's face it, Mikko Rantanen right now stands to maybe be the number 1 UFA hitting the market July 1st. He's so close already. If you're him, don't you want to take a peek at the open market?
Yeah, I'm going to go less that he's traded. I'm just going to saw it off at 10 and 10. 10% chance he's traded for everything that Chris just said. They paid the premium to acquire him. He's a huge piece of their quest to win a Stanley Cup. If they go deep into the playoffs, then maybe that improves his chances of signing. But everything that I've learned around this since he was traded by the Colorado Avalanche is that he likes the look of free agency and picking his long-term home. So that can change, but I'm going 10 and 10.
So stays for a run and then moves on based on the insider percentages. Let's talk about the Buffalo Sabres. We hear about players available in Buffalo. They're all good young players that a franchise you'd think would want to make part of the future. Yet it always seems to be the narrative in Buffalo that good young players might be on the way out. I'm thinking of Cousins, Peterka, Byram. CJ, how many of those 3 could you see Buffalo moving before the start of next year?
Ooh. Well, I could see it being 0, but I feel like that's an unsatisfactory answer. I mean, they're right now at the bottom of the Eastern Conference. This is their 14th straight year where they're going to miss the playoffs. There's questions about the front office's future, like who's making that decision. Right now Kevin Adams is still in charge. He's been very, cognizant of maybe some of the decisions that have made even before his time as the GM, doesn't want to give up on them at the wrong time. Obviously, there's a reason why people are lining up, knocking on his door for Dylan Cousins. I mean, if I told you that they traded him and he went on and was the next guy that had all the success elsewhere, would that surprise anyone? No, and it wouldn't surprise the Sabres. They love the player. So I feel like they're going to be under huge pressure, though, to trade somebody before next season to shake up something. They've done the coach X amount of times. In fact, there's been a number of GMs through there. I think they have to do something to that roster. So it's only on the fact that I don't have any info on this. It's more just I can't imagine they're rolling back the same core next year. And so I'll say one of those players gets dealt, but probably not by Friday. I'm thinking more in the offseason.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree with that. And here's why I agree with that. I know Adams has been offered numerous first-round draft picks to this point for those players. And
Right.
Those are future considerations, obviously, and that hasn't gotten it done. Because Buffalo needs players. They need players to help them now and obviously shepherd them into a better future. That is the goal. So Adams remains open for that big move. He knows he needs to shake things up. But if you're pushing away from first-round draft picks now, with the deadline looming, then that's a pretty clear message that those players aren't available right now because they're too important to the teams that they're on right now. So I think that this is more likely in the offseason.
Dregs, team that you are potentially or that will potentially surprise us on deadline day that you guys are sitting there talking about in your final hit of the day on SportsCenter that you weren't expecting to.
Interesting. Well, one team is hard because I kind of like Vegas comes to mind, but that wouldn't surprise anyone. I mean, that's what Kelly McCrimmon and the Vegas Golden Knights do when they've got cap space. I hinted at Florida earlier and the possibilities of what Billy Zito might still have up his sleeve. I mean, would that qualify, right? If he lands a Besser or somebody, I mean, does that qualify as a surprise? Beyond that, nobody jumps off the page right now. I mean, we went through the 7 Canadian teams, possibility of Ottawa doing something bigger. Don't know. Maybe if Edmonton landed something that mattered, that might be a bit of a surprise given all of their challenges.
Or if we thought they weren't going to spend the money and then all of a sudden just did in a hailstorm of trades because they changed their mind last minute and said, spend the money, CJ.
I'm going to go with Tampa. I mean, for me, it's never a bad bet on Julian Brisebois doing something quiet and bold.
Like
and, look at the Lightning won 8 in a row. They just had their winning streak snapped on Monday night, but they've been very hot. They've been under the radar. Brisebois made a pretty ballsy decision to let Stamkos walk a year ago, right? And signs Gensel. And I just think he's going to want to give his team every chance to get back to a Stanley Cup, to go on a run. The East feels wide open, even though some of those teams have gotten hot, like Florida and Tampa, some traditional powers, we'll call them. But I think the Lightning, no one's really talking about what they might do. And I could see them, swooping in and doing something that makes us all go, holy, wow, what a move.
Quite the arms race happening in Florida. I'll give CJ first star on that answer. But in fairness, you had a minute to think about it. You had a minute to think about it, CJ Dregs. I dropped that one right square on your forehead. But you recovered nicely with the Edmonton suggestion. Okay, a couple of little insider things. Biggest scoop on deadline day or biggest UFA signing on July 1st? Which would be the better get for you, Dregs, if you could choose between those two scoops?
Trade, always. Just because some of that stuff on deadline day happens very, very quickly, right? You don't have the days leading up. And even though it's not supposed to happen because technically it's tampering, I mean, who's kidding who? We basically have a sound idea, or the agent and the teams have a pretty sound idea of what free agency looks like before they're actually allowed to do the business on July 1st. So when you get a big trade on deadline day, that's a tough one to beat in our business.
Yeah, it's our Super Bowl. That's how I view it. It's the biggest, the most eyeballs. It's in the middle of the season. You're right. July 1st is just more orderly, all things considered. Deadline day can be quite chaotic where you're just, chasing your tail all over town. And so if you can ever connect with a belt tie fastball on deadline day, I think I'd take that over July 1st anytime.
All right. Well, it's going to be tons of fun, guys. This was tons of fun, too. CJ, thanks so much for your time, my friend. Look forward to reading your stuff in The Athletic in the coming days. And, of course, you're a massive part of the team at TSN as well. So look forward to your stuff in the upcoming days, pal.
Thanks for having me. That was fun. I could go for another hour if you had it. So that was good.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no problem. Dregs will lead up 45 minutes of that. All right, Dregs, thanks, buddy. Have a good week. Don't burn up the phone too much. And I guess we'll drop another Ray and Dregs. And Ray Ferraro will be back with us. We'll drop another pod Friday after the deadline is the plan, correct?
Correct. Yeah, looking forward to it. There was some talk of potentially going live, but I don't see that as being likely at this point.
Yeah, maybe we'll save that. We'll save that
road,
maybe for season 7 of Ray and Dregs. Anyways, thanks to all of you for tuning in, for your downloads and your subscriptions. We greatly appreciate it, and look forward to what's going to be a fascinating week ahead. Big thanks to our sponsors as well, Tim Hortons, and of course, Acon. Talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.